Welcome, dreamers, to another bedtime story. This dark fantasy tale is about two young men on a glorious journey. Bundle up, get ready, and let us begin.
The hollow bells tolled beneath a crimson sky. Aldrich stood at the edge of the black cliffs, the cold wind dragging fingers through his dark hair. Below him, the sea churned, a sickly green beneath the failing light of dusk. Beyond the jagged horizon, the outline of the hollow keep rose like a broken spine, dark towers twisting upward into the wounded sky. "It's calling you, isn't it?" Caleb's voice was low, steady. His dark cloak billowed behind him as he stepped to Aldrich's side. Pale scars mapped the sharp line of his jaw, and his hand rested easily on the hilt of his sword. Aldrich's gaze sharpened on the distant keep. The weight beneath his ribs pulsed steadily, slow and dark. "It never stopped calling," Aldrich said. His voice was a thread of breath against the wind. Selim's eyes narrowed. "We don't have to do this." Aldrich's mouth curled bitterly. "Yes, we do." The waves crashed far below. The cliffs moaned beneath their feet. And from across the dying sea, the hollow tolling of the bells deepened, slow and endless, sinking into Aldrich's bones. "Let's go," Aldrich said. They moved through the salt-stained air, the path down the cliffs jagged beneath their boots. Aldrich's cloak dragged through the wet grit of the rock. Calem's steps were steady, but Aldrich could feel the tension humming beneath his movements. His friend's hand lingered on the hilt of his sword. "The bells started 3 nights ago," Selim murmured. "I know." Aldrich's gaze darkened. "It's waking." Selim's eyes sharpened beneath the pale light. "Why now?" "It's been stirring beneath the earth for centuries," Aldrich said. His hand curled over his chest. Beneath his ribs, the scar pulsed cold. "But this time, it's different." They crossed the jagged shoreline, waves licking at the edges of their boots. The hollow keep loomed closer, dark spires twisting into the rotting sky. The ancient stone was black with sea salt and centuries of rot. "What exactly are we looking for?" Calem's voice was low. Aldrich's mouth tightened. "Answers." Calem's gaze darkened. "Or retribution." Aldrich didn't answer. They reached the gate. It yawned wide and empty, carved from black stone. The sigils along the archway had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and salt. Aldrich stepped forward. Calem's hand shot out, closing around his arm.
"It could be a trap."
"It is a trap." Aldrich pulled free and stepped into the darkness. "Stay close." The air within the keep was thick and heavy. A sharp metallic scent hung beneath the damp stone. Their footsteps echoed. Water dripped from the vaulted ceiling. "How long has it been abandoned?" Calem whispered. 1,000 years. "Then why does it feel?" Calem's breath sharpened. "Alive?" Aldrich's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. "Because it is." The corridor opened into a vast hall. Dark pillars rose toward the black ceiling. Faint light filtered through the stained glass high above, casting sickly crimson shapes across the stone floor. At the far end of the hall, a figure knelt before a black altar. Aldrich's breath sharpened. "Do you see that?" Calem's voice was low. "I see it." The figure's head lifted slowly. Beneath the hood, empty black sockets peered toward them. A thin, dry whisper drifted through the air. "The crown calls you." Aldrich's hand shot to his sword. "Identify yourself." Calem's blade hissed from its sheath. The figure rose. Bone-white hands extended from the dark robes. "You have already heard the call." Darkness pulsed beneath Aldrich's chest. "What do you want?" Aldrich growled. "To serve." The figure's mouth twisted into a dark smile. "Take the crown." Aldrich's pulse hammered. His vision darkened. The weight beneath his chest flared hotter. "Aldrich," Calem's hand closed over his arm. "Don't listen." "You cannot resist it." Aldrich's vision sharpened. His breath came fast and cold. The figure extended both hands, and the black iron of the crown of Hollowmere shimmered beneath the dim light. "Take it." "Aldrich," Calem's voice was sharp now. "It's a choice," Aldrich whispered, "or a curse." The figure stepped closer. "It is both." Aldrich's hand lifted toward the crown. The weight beneath his chest surged outward, a cold pulse through his veins. "Don't." Calem's hand closed hard around his arm. "You cannot fight it." Aldrich's gaze darkened. His breath sharpened. "Watch me." His sword flashed. The figure screamed, a thin, brittle sound, as the iron blade cut through dark silk. The figure's body collapsed into smoke. The crown hovered in the air, pulsing dark light. Selim's hand shot toward Aldrich's arm. "We need to go." The walls groaned. The hall began to collapse around them. "Aldrich!" The crown pulsed harder. Aldrich's hand twitched toward it. "Aldrich!" Calem's arm wrapped around his chest, dragging him backward. The hall exploded into dust and stone. They hit the ground hard, stone crashing around them. Dust curled through the cold air. Aldrich's breath came fast and sharp. Calem's arm was still wrapped around his chest. His breath brushed against Aldrich's neck. "Are you with me?" Calem's voice was low and steady. Aldrich's eyes darkened beneath the low light. His chest ached. The pulse beneath his ribs was slower now, but steady. "I'm with you." Calem's hand lingered on his shoulder. His gaze narrowed. "Good." The silence stretched between them. Dust curled through the broken stone. Calem's mouth curled faintly. "Next time, try listening to me." Aldrich's breath sharpened. His gaze lifted toward the broken altar where the crown of Hollowmere had disappeared into the dark. "It's not over," Aldrich said. Calem's gaze darkened. "No, it's not." Aldrich pushed himself to his feet. Selim followed. Their shadows stretched long beneath the broken moonlight. Aldrich's gaze sharpened toward the dark horizon. "It's awake now." Calem's mouth curled into a grim smile. "Then we'll have to put it back to sleep." They moved toward the broken archway. The hollow bells tolled in the distance, low and endless beneath the night sky. The broken hall behind them sank into shadow as Aldrich and Selim moved through the keep's darkened corridors. The stone beneath their boots was slick with ancient moisture, and the walls pressed inward, narrow veins of black iron threading through dark stone. The scent of rot and cold metal clung to the air. Aldrich's hand hovered near the hilt of his sword. His heartbeat pulsed heavy beneath his ribs, slow and dark, echoing the rhythmic tolling of the bells. The keep was awake now. He could feel it breathing through the walls. The stones whispered beneath his boots, and the cold light filtering through the narrow windows pulsed faintly, a sickly glow shifting between dark crimson and pale green. Calem moved ahead, his shoulders tense beneath his dark cloak. His movements were measured, controlled, but Aldrich could see the tension in his friend's jaw, the subtle flick of his gaze toward every shadowed alcove. They both knew this place was no longer empty. A narrow archway loomed before them. Black vines curled across the stone, their brittle thorns crusted with flakes of old blood. Calem's hand brushed against the edge of the arch as he stepped through, his breath sharp in the cold. Beyond the archway, the corridor widened into a great hall. The ceiling stretched upward into darkness, where the flickering glow of pale witchlight pulsed along the vaulted arches. The walls were lined with statues, tall figures in dark cloaks, their faces eroded by time. Chains hung from their stone wrists, their ends broken and rusted. The figures seemed to lean inward, their eyeless faces turned toward Aldrich and Selim. Aldrich's gaze sharpened. He could feel the weight of their empty stares pressing down on him. A thin, echoing breath threaded through the cold air, a sound that was not their own. Calem's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. His gaze flicked toward Aldrich. A silent question passed between them. Aldrich's mouth hardened. He stepped forward. At the center of the hall, a pool of dark water spread across the cracked floor. Its surface was smooth, untouched by the stale air. Aldrich's boots halted at the edge. His reflection swam beneath the glassy surface, distorted and pale, his eyes dark with the flickering light of the witchfire above. Calem stepped beside him. His reflection did not appear in the water. Aldrich's breath sharpened. He reached toward the water. The surface rippled beneath his fingers. A dark shape shifted beneath the surface, slow and immense. Then it opened its eyes. Pale amber light burned beneath the glassy water. The shape coiled beneath the surface, black tendrils unfurling toward the edge of the pool. A hollow, wet sound vibrated through the stone beneath their feet. Aldrich's hand jerked back. Calem's sword flashed free of its sheath. The surface of the water shattered. A dark shape surged upward, black and serpentine, gleaming beneath the sickly light of the hall. Tendrils of shadow lashed toward them, slicing through the air. Aldrich's sword was already in his hand. He swung hard, steel meeting shadow. The impact sent a sharp vibration through his arm. Black ichor sprayed across the cracked floor. Calem lunged beside him. His blade swept through the dark tendrils, severing them in a burst of cold smoke. The creature's pale eyes burned beneath the shifting black mass of its body. It struck again, fast and precise. Aldrich twisted beneath the blow, steel flashing as he drove the blade upward through the shadowed coil. A soundless scream reverberated through the air. The creature dissolved into smoke and dark liquid, spilling across the stone floor in a wave of cold. Aldrich's breath came fast and sharp. Calum's hand settled on his arm. The pool had gone still again. The dark liquid was already sinking into the cracks of the stone. "What was that?" Calum's voice was low and hard. Aldrich's gaze darkened. His pulse was still hammering beneath his ribs. "A warning," he said. Calum's mouth tightened. His gaze swept toward the dark archway beyond the pool. "Then we'd better keep moving." They moved toward the arch. The sound of the tolling bells followed them, deeper now, closer. The corridor narrowed into a spiral stairway carved from dark stone. Aldrich led the way, his hand trailing along the rough wall as they climbed upward. The air grew thinner and colder. A thin pulse of dark magic pressed beneath his skin. His breath sharpened. At the top of the stairs, the path opened into another hall, this one smaller, lined with black iron sconces. The torches burned with pale blue light. Strange carvings marked the walls, twisted symbols and jagged script etched deep into the stone. Aldrich didn't recognize the language, but he could feel the power threaded beneath the shapes. It coiled beneath his skin, dark and ancient. At the far end of the hall, a door of black wood stood closed. A sigil burned faintly across its surface, a pale white crown encircled by jagged thorns. Calum's breath sharpened behind him. "Is that—" "Yes!" Aldrich's mouth tightened. He stepped forward. The sigil pulsed brighter beneath his gaze. His hand rose toward the door, his palm barely grazing the surface. Cold burned through his fingertips. The sigil flared brighter. Then it shattered. The door opened inward with a hollow creak. Beyond the threshold, darkness pressed outward, thick and breathing. Aldrich stepped through first. The air was colder here, damp and sharp. The floor beneath his boots was wet stone. A single throne stood at the center of the dark chamber, black iron and bone, jagged and twisted. Chains hung from the arms, the ends broken. Dark veins of iron threaded through the floor beneath it, pulsing faintly with sick light. A figure sat slumped in the throne, pale limbs folded beneath dark robes. Its face was thin and hollow, sunken eyes burning faintly beneath the dark hood. The air trembled with the slow rise and fall of its breath. Aldrich's gaze sharpened. His sword lifted slightly, the figure's head tilted upward, empty black eyes fixed on him. "Welcome home." The cold pulse beneath Aldrich's ribs deepened. His breath came slow and sharp. Calum's hand hovered at his side. "What are you?" Aldrich's voice was steady. The figure's mouth curled faintly. "The end." The air collapsed inward. Darkness surged across the floor, the iron veins flaring white beneath it. Aldrich's sword was already in motion. He didn't see Calum move. Only the flash of steel beside him as they lunged toward the figure together. Aldrich's sword struck first. Steel met shadow in a burst of cold fire, black tendrils curling and shrieking beneath the impact. The figure rose from the throne in a single fluid motion, dark robes unraveling into smoke. Its hollow gaze burned white as it lifted one pale hand. Darkness poured from its palm, thick coils of smoke and bone. The air collapsed inward. Aldrich's breath shortened as the weight of it pressed against his chest. His feet slid against the cold stone beneath him. Calum moved without hesitation. His sword flashed toward the figure's side, cutting through the tendrils of smoke. The blade struck true, but the figure's body dissolved beneath the impact, reforming in a rush of cold air behind him. "Faster," Aldrich growled, spinning toward the figure's new position. His sword lashed toward its chest. Metal met flesh. A thin hiss escaped the figure's mouth as black ichor dripped from the wound. The figure's gaze sharpened. "Mortal steel cannot kill me." "We'll see about that." Calum's voice was low and sharp. His blade flashed upward, slicing toward the figure's throat. The figure's body twisted unnaturally, bending away from the strike. Its pale hand lifted. A shockwave of cold exploded outward. Aldrich felt the impact slam through his chest. He staggered, boots scraping against the stone shaft. Calum hit the floor beside him, breath ragged. The figure's empty gaze swept over them. "You are not prepared for this place." Aldrich's teeth bared. His sword flared with cold silver light as he rose to his feet. "Try me." The figure's mouth curled faintly. Its hand lifted again. Dark chains unfurled from the ceiling. Black iron streaked with pale light. The chains lashed downward. Aldrich's sword moved instinctively. Steel met iron with a grinding shriek. Sparks exploded into the cold air. His arm burned beneath the force of the strike. Selim's blade caught another chain mid-swing, severing it in a burst of dark smoke. He rolled to his feet, eyes sharp beneath the flickering light. "Enough of this," Aldrich growled. He stepped toward the figure, sword raised. "Let's see how well you bleed." The figure's gaze darkened. Aldrich lunged. His blade drove toward the figure's chest and passed straight through it. Cold, hollow, empty. The figure's hand closed around his wrist. Black fire burned beneath its touch. Aldrich's breath sharpened. "I told you," the figure whispered. "You cannot kill me." Aldrich's eyes narrowed. His free hand darted toward the silver pendant beneath his cloak, a thin circle of etched runes. His fingers closed around it. Magic pulsed beneath his grip. Caelim's blade was already moving. It flashed beneath the dim light, driven not toward the figure's body, but toward the chains hanging from the ceiling. The blade struck true. The chain shattered with a sound like breaking bone. The figure's body wavered. Its grip on Aldrich's wrist weakened. "Now!" Aldrich growled. Selim's sword struck the next chain, and the next. With each break, the figure's form twisted and flickered, smoke unraveling from its limbs. Its empty gaze sharpened. No, Aldrich's sword drove forward. This time, it struck solid flesh. The figure's mouth opened in a soundless scream. Black smoke exploded outward. Aldrich braced himself as the force of it tore through the chamber. Caelim's hand caught his arm, steadying him as the figure's body collapsed inward. Dark ichor pooled across the cold stone. The throne crumbled beneath it. The chains hanging from the ceiling snapped and fell. Silence followed. Aldrich's breath slowed. His grip loosened on his sword. Caelim's hand remained on his arm. His gaze was sharp beneath the low light. "Is it dead?" Aldrich's gaze swept toward the dark pool of ichor at their feet. "No." His mouth tightened. "It's waiting." Caelim's jaw tensed. "Then we'd better keep moving." They stepped over the broken remnants of the throne and moved toward the far end of the chamber. A narrow archway yawned open there, black stone threaded with veins of pale silver. Cold light pulsed faintly from the cracks. Aldrich's gaze sharpened. He stepped through first. Beyond the archway, the corridor narrowed into a descending stairway. The walls were rough and slick with cold moisture. Dark vines curled along the edges, their thorns glinting beneath the pale light. Caelim's footsteps echoed behind him. "This is going deeper than I expected." Aldrich's mouth tightened. "We're not at the heart yet." Caelim's gaze sharpened. "And when we reach it?" Aldrich's hand hovered near the hilt of his sword. His breath curled white in the cold air. "Then we find out why it's awake." The stairway spiraled downward, the light thinned into shadow. Cold pressed against their skin. At the base of the stairway, the path opened into another hall. This one was smaller, narrower. The floor was carved from black obsidian, veined with flickering lines of silver light. Dark symbols were etched into the stone beneath their feet. At the far end of the hall, another door stood closed. This one was larger, black iron streaked with pale blue fire. Runes burned along the edges. The sigil at its center was ancient and familiar, a twisted crown surrounded by black thorns. Caelim's breath sharpened. "We've seen that before," he said quietly. Aldrich's gaze darkened. "Yes." He stepped toward the door. The sigil flared brighter beneath his gaze. The weight of ancient magic pressed against his chest. His hand rose toward the sigil. A voice cut through the silence. "Do you know where you stand?" The air rippled. Pale blue light pulsed from the sigil. "Do you know whose throne you seek?" Aldrich's breath sharpened. His hand settled on the hilt of his sword. "Yes," he said. The voice was hollow and low. "Then you already know how this ends." Aldrich's mouth hardened. His hand pressed against the sigil. The door shuddered beneath his touch. Cold surged through his palm. The iron split beneath his hand, and the door opened. Beyond it, darkness pressed outward. Thick, breathing, Aldrich stepped forward. Selim followed. "So be it." They crossed the threshold together, and the darkness closed behind them. Aldrich and Selim stepped deeper into the black. The cold sharpened as they moved forward, cutting beneath their armor and seeping into bone. Their footsteps echoed against the stone. Sharp, hollow sounds swallowed quickly by the dark. The corridor narrowed. Faint lines of silver etched the walls. Ancient patterns spiraling outward in twisting shapes. They pulsed faintly, cold light flickering beneath the surface. Aldrich's hand tightened around his sword. His breath curled white in the frigid air. "I can feel it." Salem murmured. His voice was low, cutting beneath the silence. It's waking. Aldrich's gaze narrowed. Then we'd better be ready. They stepped into a widening chamber. The air pressed heavier here. The floor beneath their feet was polished obsidian, veined with pulsing light. At the far end of the room, a single dais rose from the stone, a pale circle marked with sigils. And at the center of the dais, a figure stood waiting, tall, wrapped in black robes. Its face was veiled in shadow, the edges of it curling like smoke. A thin crown of dark metal circled its head, points rising toward the ceiling like broken thorns. Its hollow gaze burned white beneath the veil. Aldrich's sword lifted instinctively, his pulse hammered beneath his skin. The figure's mouth curled faintly. You have crossed the threshold of the Hollow Keep. Calem's breath sharpened, his blade hovered beneath the dim light. And we're not leaving without answers. The figure's gaze sharpened. The crown upon its brow pulsed faintly, a dark light coiling beneath the metal. Answers? It whispered. Is that what you seek? The air thickened. Dark smoke curled across the chamber floor. You will not like the answers you find. Aldrich's breath sharpened. His blade lifted higher. We'll take that risk. The figure's hollow gaze darkened. Its hand lifted. Shadows curled from its palm, thin tendrils of smoke that spread like veins across the floor. Then come and see. The floor beneath their feet pulsed. The chamber shifted. Walls twisted inward. Chains unraveled from the ceiling, black iron streaked with pale silver light. The sigils along the floor burned brighter, and the figure moved. Faster than breath. Aldrich's sword lashed toward its chest. The blade passed through empty shadow. The figure's hand closed around his wrist. Cold burned beneath its touch. Calem's blade swept upward. Steel caught the figure's arm. The figure's body twisted. Black smoke unraveled from its limbs. It swept toward Salem in a dark wave. Calem rolled beneath the strike. His sword flashed outward, cutting through the smoke. Dark ichor splashed across the floor. The figure's gaze sharpened. Its hand lifted. A ring of pale light erupted across the chamber. Chains lashed downward. Aldrich caught the nearest one with his blade. Sparks erupted beneath the strike. Salem moved beside him. His sword caught another chain mid-fall. The figure's hollow gaze burned brighter. You think you can fight this? Aldrich's gaze darkened. We fought worse. The figure's mouth curled faintly. Have you? The walls shuddered. The chains twisted inward. Dark shapes gathered beneath the pale light. Twisted figures rising from the floor, hollow bodies wrapped in dark smoke. Their empty eyes flared white. Aldrich's breath sharpened. Salem. Calem was already moving. His sword caught the first figure mid-step. Steel met flesh. Dark ichor splashed across the stone. The other figures surged forward. Aldrich's sword swept upward. The nearest figure's body split beneath the strike. Dark smoke spilled from the wound. Don't let them surround us, Aldrich growled. Calem's sword flashed toward the next figure. Steel met bone. The figure collapsed beneath the strike, unraveling into smoke. The hollow-eyed figures moved faster. Their hands stretched toward Aldrich, black claws curling toward his chest. Aldrich's sword swept wide. Smoke split beneath the strike. The central figure watched them from the dais. Its gaze sharpened. The crown upon its brow pulsed brighter. Enough, the figures froze. Dark chains erupted from the floor, black iron wrapping around Aldrich's legs and arms. Cold burned beneath his skin. His sword wavered beneath his grip. Calem's blade swept toward the chains. A shockwave of cold threw him backward. Salem's body struck the floor. His breath sharpened. Aldrich's gaze darkened. His hands strained beneath the chains. His sword flickered with pale light. The figure's gaze swept toward him. Do you know what lies beneath this keep? Aldrich's breath sharpened. His arms strained beneath the chains. The figure's mouth curled faintly. Blood. The chains tightened. Cold fire burned beneath Aldrich's skin. Sacrifice. The figure's hand lifted. A pale blade of light unraveled from its palm. And you. Aldrich's teeth bared. Light pulsed beneath his palm. Will give it freely. The figure's blade swept downward. Salem's sword caught it mid-strike. Steel met light in a burst of white fire. Calem's breath sharpened. His arms strained beneath the impact. Not today, he growled. Aldrich's hand closed around the silver pendant beneath his cloak. Magic pulsed beneath his grip. Light erupted outward. The chains shattered beneath the force of it. Aldrich's sword flashed toward the figure's chest. The blade struck true. Dark ichor erupted beneath the impact. The figure's mouth opened in a soundless scream. Selim's sword followed. Light flared beneath the strike. The figure's body unraveled beneath the force of it, black smoke twisting inward. No. The crown fell from the figure's brow. Darkness exploded outward. Aldrich's breath sharpened. He staggered beneath the impact. Salem's hand caught his arm, steadying him. The chamber darkened. The figures on the floor dissolved into smoke. The crown lay at their feet, dark metal glinting beneath the pale light. Aldrich's breath steadied. His gaze darkened beneath the flickering light. "It's done," Calum said quietly. Aldrich's hand hovered above the crown. "No," he said. "It's only beginning." The floor beneath them trembled. The chamber's walls darkened. "Time to go," Salem said. They turned toward the archway at the far end of the room. Pale light flickered beyond it. Aldrich's gaze lingered on the crown. His hand tightened around his sword, and they stepped into the light. Aldrich and Salem stepped into the pale light beyond the archway. The trembling beneath their feet stilled as they crossed the threshold, leaving the shattered crown behind. The corridor narrowed, then widened into a steep stairwell curling upward toward the surface. The cold lingered, clinging to their skin as they climbed. Calum's breath steadied. His sword remained drawn as he followed Aldrich's shadow upward. That thing said the keep was built on blood, sacrifice. Aldrich's gaze darkened. It wasn't lying. They reached the top of the stairwell. A pair of heavy iron doors stood before them, sealed with twisted chains of black iron. The remnants of ancient sigils flickered weakly beneath the metal. Aldrich's hand lifted, his palm pressed against the cold surface. Light pulsed beneath his skin. The chains dissolved beneath his touch, curling into ash. The doors creaked open. A flood of moonlight spilled inward. Cool night air brushed their skin. Stars blinked overhead, pale and distant against the black sky. They stepped out onto a ledge overlooking the hollow mountains. The jagged peaks stretched beneath the moonlight, pale mist curling through the valleys below. The cold wind pulled at their cloaks. Aldrich's gaze lingered on the horizon. His hand hovered over the hilt of his sword. Calum stepped beside him, his breath curled white beneath the cold. What now? Aldrich's gaze narrowed. We burned the rot from this place, but the roots run deeper than the keep. Calum's mouth curled faintly. That sounds like trouble. Aldrich's gaze sharpened beneath the moonlight. Then we'd better be ready. They descended the rocky path, their shadows stretching long beneath the pale light. Behind them, the hollow keep darkened beneath the stars, a hollow shell sinking into the mountain's cold embrace. The crown lay untouched beneath the broken dais, dark metal glinting beneath the pale light. A thin crack spread across its surface, a faint pulse of shadow flickered beneath the iron, and in the depths beneath the keep, something stirred. Aldrich and Salem vanished beneath the dark horizon, their cloaks trailing behind them. The path stretched long and narrow beneath the starlit sky. The mountains watched in silence as they disappeared into the night, and far behind them, beneath the crumbling stone of the hollow keep, the echo of dark magic pulsed faintly in the cold, waiting for when the light would fail again.